Hello and welcome to episode 414 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Parrott, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you today, Bill?
Hey, I'm doing great, Seth. I just want to do a shout out to Navy Cycling. There's a group of guys from my alma mater, the United States Naval Academy, who are riding their bicycles across the country to raise money for veterans charities. And if you want to support that, go to navy-cycling.com. Navy-cycling.com. Great group of guys, great charity. So back to you, Seth.
That's very cool. Very Forrest Gump-ish, but I like it. I dig it.
It is. Yeah, they're going to get across the Rockies and say, I think I'm about done now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
I want to go home.
Yeah.
Goodness gracious. Well, obviously, we have third member of our crew with us today, our fantastic historian and good buddy, Jon Parshall. Jon, how are you now that you have returned from the South Pacific?
The lovely South Pacific. I'm considerably better because I get to sleep in my own bed and eat my wife's delicious cookies. So yeah, living the dream.
That is always a better rate than sleeping anywhere else. I'm always going to sleep in my own bed anytime I can, for sure. Before we get started, we do want to ask you to like and subscribe to the channel. If you have done so, thank you. If you haven't done so, please do so. So, an aerial invasion of the Japanese home islands had happened before. On April 18th, 1942, Colonel James H. Doolittle and his raiders launched from the USS Hornet CV-8 and hit various targets in and around the Tokyo area. The raid, known in history as the Doolittle Raid, was a pinprick on the Japanese war machine and was more symbolic than anything else. The 16 Army B-25s did little damage and were, at the time, the largest strike that the Americans could throw at their enemy. For the Americans at the time, it seemed significant. 16 medium bombers launching from one of two aircraft carriers and surrounded by a screen of 12 ships was significant in 1942. But that was then. Fast forward 34 months later to February 1945. Cruising off the coast of Japan was a force that was so large and powerful that it could scarcely have been imagined back in those dark days at the beginning of the war. Marc Mitscher's Task Force 58, under the overall command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, prowled the seas a mere 60 miles off of Honshu with an eye-popping armada of 116 warships. At the heart of those 116 warships were Mitscher's fast carriers, all 16 of them, their flight decks throbbing with the rhythmic whir of more than 1,100 aircraft engines, all revving up to launch the first carrier-borne strike on Tokyo since the Doolittle Raid. For the first time since 1942, American aircraft, and for the first time ever, United States Navy and Marine Corps aircraft would invade the skies over Japanese home islands to bring the war very, very close to their enemy. Guys, this is, when you look in the pantheon of Pacific War history, these raids that we're about to talk about here it's a small chapter, but it's an important chapter nonetheless because it does a lot of different things and it's an evolution of American fighting ability in the United States Navy. And that's something I know we're going to talk about today. But this is a type of raid, guys, that had been on the minds of Spruance and Halsey for a long time. And I'm not take Doolittle Raid out of the equation, but this is something that had been on their minds for a long time, was to hit the home islands. And the reasons for this were many, and not the least of which is, the fear factor, if you will, of hitting the Japanese home islands and what it could and would potentially do to the Japanese. Halsey had taken Task Force 38 into the South China Sea. Bill, you and I talked about this just a few episodes ago about going in there in January of 45 and raiding, places like Saigon and places like that. And what he had wanted to do was it was a strategic strike. And Bill, you talk about this all the time: strategic versus tactical. And Halsey's raid was strategic, and that he was going in there and knock out the shipping lanes and secure the sea lines of communication and all this around that area to the Japanese home islands. But Spruance's raid was a little bit different, wasn't it?
Yeah, John's going to jump in on this because I know he's done chapter and verse on these issues. But this, what Spruance wants to do at this point is kind of try to knock down some of the tactical aviation the Japanese are throwing at them, mostly in the way of kamikazes. And so, while this may be tactical from the standpoint of defensive, to try to suppress the kamikaze threat, it's a tactical raid with strategic implications because the Japanese now know this isn't a few B-25s. This is a bunch, hundreds of airplanes. Not only that, the B-20, the bombers throughout the war, even later, when we start getting into black snow and those kinds of operations, they're flying at relatively high altitudes and are relatively imprecise in their targeting accuracy. The Navy planes can get in low, very precise, and much more tactically effective than many of the Army Air Force's planes were at this point. John, do you agree?
Yeah, generally, yeah. Although with that comes a much higher degree of risk as well, because as we're going to be talking about in this episode, the Japanese later in the war are able to create light AA environments that are extremely inimical and difficult to survive in. So there's got to be an assumption of risk that comes along with this, that, yeah, we're going to do more, zeroed in kind of strikes on this, but you're going to lose a lot of planes. There's no way around that. So that's something to consider. The other factor that I think is important to talk about too is just from the standpoint of Japanese civilian morale. The loss of the Marianas in the middle of 1944 is a real bellwether, and the more perceptive people within Japan are already thinking, yeah, this does not augur well. Some of them know about the capabilities of the B-29. Well, the B-29 has now showed up over Japan, but at this point in time, that we're talking about, January, February in 1945, that force is still being utilized by Haywood Hansel in a ostensibly precision bombing mode, and they ain't doing much. The jet stream is terrible. The weather conditions are often socked in. And so even though it's a shock to the Japanese to see these big bombers overhead, it's going to be quite a different thing for them to realize that there's an enormous carrier force now off our shores. And as you say, 60 miles away from the home islands. Oh my God, talk about being right on your doorstep. That sends a very powerful message to the Japanese. You are now within carrier strike range, and we are bringing the war, as I say, right to your doorstep.
Indeed, for several days too, at least.
Yeah.
So on January the 26th, 1945, Halsey turns command over to Spruance, and the Fifth Fleet is reborn yet again. As viewers or listeners will recall, this happens several times, and it's going to happen again after Okinawa too. Spruance was well aware, and we've talked about this. We talked about this about the Iwo Jima episodes that aired, actually the second one aired today. That Spruance was well aware that Iwo Jima was the next target on the list for the Central Pacific Drive, and that the casualties were going to be high. It was estimated that casualties were going to be, and of course they are, were going to be horrendous. He was well aware of the kamikaze threat that had been hitting like Bill said, that had been hitting the U.S. fleet since October. And he was well aware, too, that Iwo Jima, being as close as it is to the home islands, the kamikazes are more than likely going to come at him. Excuse me. So to that end, he felt that he needed to hit these home islands, specifically Tokyo and later Kyushu, to knock these airplanes down. He was well aware of the time that the Japanese had to reinforce and build up on Iwo Jima's defenses. And he, as I said, he knew it was closer. So he had to knock these things up in any effort to disrupt these landings that the Japanese were going to try and do, to avoid the potential of a seaborne aerial bloodbath that we're going to see off of Okinawa. Yeah. Spruance directs Marc Mitscher to plan for and execute a raid on the Japanese home islands themselves, specifically Honshu and the Tokyo area for the first raid. We're going to talk about two. Yeah. Desiring to hit aircraft assembly plants, repair facilities, and especially airfields, Spruance told Mitscher, quote, "I am tired of fighting them all along the perimeter," unquote. Those are his exact words. His desire to hit the home islands was threefold here, and this goes into what both of you guys talked about. First, he wanted to keep the kamikaze threat down on the landings on Iwo Jima. Second, he felt that by striking the home islands with the fast carriers, the Japanese would believe, John, to your point, that there was no way that a large-scale invasion would take place with the U.S. Navy striking power so far away, and it was to put that fear of God into the Japanese people in some way, shape, or form. B-29s flying from the Marianas at 30,000 feet is a scary sight, but the Japanese are not stupid. The Japanese citizenry, they're not stupid people. They're going to see these blue airplanes, and they're going to know damn well they did not come from the Marianas. These came from aircraft carriers. So, Bill, you talked about it. You touched on it very briefly, and we're going to go into it in a couple of weeks with James Scott. We're talking about strategic bombing, getting down into the dirty weeds, but they were not very accurate, the B-29s, as they were coming over Japan, were they? Not at this stage, anyway.
And before we get in, there's a parenthetically, when I did my special episode on Charles McVeigh, the CEO of the Indianapolis, of course, Spruance is commanding this operation from the Indianapolis, I showed a photograph that I couldn't tie down, which is him in a very warm winter coat. And I said, on the bridge wing of the Indianapolis, and I said, the only place I can imagine that this took place was in the wintertime and during the Japanese raids. Sure. So I'm thinking that photograph is tied into this raid somewhere. You know, his stepson didn't know exactly where the photograph was from, but you're right, Seth. Spruance, didn't think that the Army Air Forces were doing a lot of damage here. General Curtis LeMay had not yet unleashed those B-29s to fly at night and rain fire in Japan. The 29ers were still bombing factories from high altitude, as I said. Spruance felt that the Navy's smaller, lower-flying aircraft could be more effective, so he felt the key to hitting the home islands was going to be surprise. Now, we've been jumping around on the timeline here. Seth and I have with these various episodes. Mitscher is still in command of the task group, right? So Task Force 58. And the Admiral Spruance had forbidden any large pre-scale invasion, bombardment of Iwo Jima before this Tokyo strike. Why? Again, he's focused on surprise. And he's also stationed or requested, is more like it at this point, because remember, Admiral Lockwood still has tactical control or take on of the submarines. They haven't been chopped to Spruance in any way. So he's requested submarines to seek out and destroy any Japanese picket boats down his path. In addition to the submarines, Spruance did have take on of his destroyers, and he planned to siphon off some of those destroyers to do the same task, which is to destroy Japanese picket boats as the fleet approached, hoping to blind early warning that they were coming, Seth.
Yeah, and this goes back to the threat of the kamikazes. And John, it looked like you were about to say something, but they were so convinced that if the fleet was, and rightfully so, that if the fleet is discovered off the coast of Japan, that the kamikazes are going to come like rain. For sure. And that's exactly what they were going to do. So Spruance went so far as to even request that B-29s go out there and destroy Japanese picket boats. How that's going to happen, I really don't know. B-29 is not a strafer by any means.
No.
So I don't really get that, but that is his mania with this achieving surprise on these Japanese home islands to this stage.
Yeah, I was just going to correct myself. It is not Hansel at this point. It is LeMay. LeMay took over the B-29 force in January of 1945. So my bad on that one. Yeah,
and to put the time in perspective here, we're talking February 15th, 1945. Yeah. So this is why Bill was saying that Spruance had forbade any long pre-invasion bombardment before the 3 days that had already been allotted for the Iwo Jima operation, because he didn't want to give anything away. So in February 45, the United States Navy was absolutely, without a doubt, at the zenith of its power. Task Force 58, 38, that's all the same thing.
Whatever it is this month, yeah.
Yeah, right. right, it was packed to the gills with juice. When compared with the force that struck Tokyo in 42, Task Force 58's power is unbelievable. As I said, there were 12 ships that were part of the Doolittle Raid in 1942. Here we are in 45. There are 8 battle wagons, 15 cruisers, both heavy and light, and 77 destroyers,
Yeah.
all that are part of this. And that's not counting the main striking power, which of course is the 16 aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
Now, nearly all of these ships in Mitscher's force are new. And by that, I mean post Pearl Harbor builds, or at the very least, post Pearl Harbor commissioning.
Yeah.
They're the only 2 exceptions are the Enterprise and Saratoga. But of the 16 fleet carriers, and we can get into this here in a second, 11 were fleet, and the remainder are light carriers of the Independence class. 2 of the fleet carriers are brand new to the arena: Bennington CV-20 and Randolph CV-15. So I put in the notes we should probably go into why this is the zenith of the power, because we'd operated 16 carriers before.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the key: we had lost several carriers in the last several weeks due to kamikaze strikes, Ticonderoga being one, that were back in the yard. So that theoretically would have depleted our offensive force.
Yeah.
No, not even close, because we're at the stage in our power in terms of the United States Navy that we can rotate people in and out like a baseball lineup. So when this pitcher's tired, you send in the relief. And that's exactly what's happening here. And there's nothing that the Japanese can do about it, save kamikazes. But I mean, that's just unbelievable that we can rotate these carriers and their air groups in and out and basically keep up. And we're going to get into night fighters here in a minute. An aerial umbrella over this force 24 hours a day.
Yep.
That's
I was just going to say, at this point in the war, I think we're commissioning an Essex class carrier every other month.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be up on the whole build schedule, and actually, at this point, we've already laid down some of the Midway class carriers as well, are already building. So, yeah, the shipyards are working full tilt at this point, because we're not considering that this war is necessarily over. So we've got our foot to the pedal at this point, and are still cranking out carriers as rapidly as we can. There's no let up. So yes, to your point, yeah, we lose a few carriers to kamikaze missions, but yeah, it doesn't matter, because I got more of them working up, and I can just put new guys into the batting order.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty impressive. Well,
it's nuts. It's nuts.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking too. You think back to the Doolittle Raid; those 2 aircraft carriers at that point in time represented half of Nimitz's carrier force in the Pacific. We were down to 4 ships at that point in time.
Yeah.
So, holy Moses, this force as it is constituted right now is pretty mind bending.
It really is. And when Halsey takes over Third Fleet again, and he hits the Japanese home islands later on in the year, there's even more.
Yeah.
There's even more carriers, because I think Shangri-La comes into the, USS Shangri-La comes into play. And there's a couple of other ones that come in there. I mean, it's unfreaking real. Unreal. Yeah. So
it's 3 years.
Go ahead.
That's all done in 3 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously the money had been appropriated in 1940, and keels had started being laid towards the end of 1940. This is one of the reasons that the Japanese Navy wanted to go to war as rapidly as possible in 1941, because they understood that this building program, there's a window of opportunity, and by the time you get to 1944, that window is going to be shut, and we're seeing it now in spades.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, there's nothing. There's no other country on the planet that could have even rivaled the amount of material that we are pumping out daily from this country.
And we couldn't do that now. Anyway, on that uplifting note, Ray, continue.
Yeah. So, and this is interesting, and this is also fascinating and very important here too. So, changes had also been made in terms of the fleet's daily and nightly operations. Spruance had experimented with night operations on board aircraft carriers, specifically the Enterprise, as early as November 1943, when Butch O'Hare was lost. And we all know that story. We don't need to go into that here. And while some moderate success had been found, Halsey, and specifically John McCain, were the ones who implemented the night strike ability to the fleet. Now, Bill, we talked about this when we talked about the South China Sea raids. McCain This was a tactic that like he really believed in. He really believed that these night carrier operations were both important and useful. So he really put this into practice right after Mitscher leaves after Leyte Gulf and hands the reins over to McCain. The United States Navy turns Enterprise into a night carrier, and Independence had already been working as a night carrier. And these two carriers worked up this whole night tactic operation. Like I said, Mitscher had dabbled in some night ops at Leyte Gulf, but McCain was the guy who permanently installed night ops for the Third Fleet during their run-up, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right. And so we're going to be talking a bit about changes to different types of aircraft, for example. And by the way, this capability was unique in all the world. They're dubbed Task Force 58.5, and they were called the Night Stalkers. They were under the command of Rear Admiral Matt Gardner, former Big E skipper, and they were fielded specifically, for night operations, highly trained night naval aviators. And remember, going into this, the way you shoot down an airplane is you got to see it, right? Because the radar wasn't sufficient to really, detect and, at reasonably tactically significant ranges. So you have two big carrier groups being specifically placed on these ships for this very purpose. And they've been built to perform multi-purpose missions. There's a total of 96 of these fighters. There are some F6, F3Ns, as well as F6, F5Ns, as well as 39 TBM Avengers, TBM-1Ds, TBM-1Es, and so on. But the big advantage here was a type of radar that was eventually developed and put under the wing of the airplane in a pod that looked, significantly like today's modern AT FLIR under the F-18 Hornets. But it's a pod that goes under the wing, and this had, for that day, for 1945 standards, eye-wateringly good radar, Seth.
To the ability of United States Navy aircraft being able to do this, it all comes down, man, and I talk about nerding out. I nerded out on this. I was like, man, night fighters are cool. Let's talk about night fighters. Let me do a little digging here. I went down the rabbit hole. So big time. So the F6F3N and the F6F5N were specifically designed by Grumman to be night fighters. They were specifically designed with instrument panels, and like Bill was talking about, the radar pods that we're going to get into in just a minute, specifically designed to be launched off of aircraft carriers. And the Marines also use these things on the ground too, by the way, especially at Okinawa, but not exclusively. They were specifically designed to perform this operation. The radar that they had inside of these little pods and inside of the airplanes themselves, there's an APS-6 radar system. It was simple to operate, which was the key, because you got to remember, this is a single seat fighter. There is one dude doing everything. He's got to fly the bird. He's got to, have eyes in the back of his head, literally. And he's also got to operate this radar. Oh, and by the way, if I find an enemy airplane, I have to shoot it down too. So this APS-6 radar had a range of 5.5 miles, which is pretty good for that day. It weighed in at only 250 pounds. And I say only 250 pounds because the radar system had to be small enough and light enough to be able to fit in an airplane such as the Hellcat without limiting its range and its armaments. In other words, we can't take out fuel, and we can't lose 50 caliber ammunition in order to render this thing less effective than it needs to be. So like Bill says, it was installed in like this pod like thing on the starboard wing edge of the Hellcat. The external unit, which was in this pod, sent a signal to the receiving screen inside the airplane that showed a blip on the screen that provided the target's altitude. The little display screen was only about 2 inches in diameter. Now think about that. I mean, that's tiny. That's little. That's itty bitty. Yeah, I mean, that's itty bitty. And you got a pilot who's trying to see at night and read this screen all at the same time while doing, I don't know, 250 miles an hour to cruising altitude or cruising speed, and then, kicking into high gear when he sees the target. So it was not an easy task at all. So we're about to get some real nerdery here. All right. So
yeah, as it so happens, Seth, my first job out of the Navy was in Raytheon and McKinney, Texas, where we designed and built fighter radars. So it's a there's some interesting history. We're going to talk about the mechanical steering on this. In fact, Seth, if you want to talk about that, you can. But before you think that is ancient technology, folks. When I first joined the company in 2006, we were still building radars like that for airplanes. We didn't get to the advanced electronically steered or AESA radars until the latter part of the first decade of the 21st century. So this was, we're going to describe some stuff here. We're still putting on more advanced designs, but similar designs in 2008. Okay, right. Folks, so as we go back and talk about these silly primitive radars, think about that.
Yeah. And I was just trying to do a little real-time history here and look up the Liechtenstein radar and the scopes that it uses and whatnot, so that we can do some comparative nerdery. Unfortunately, I am not nearly as much of a German aircraft nerd, and I know we're going to have listeners thinking, be like, "Oh, Parshall's not what he's talking about here." But anyway,
absolutely.
Anyway,
we always have those listeners. They always know more than we do. Hey, and we're not God by any means, but such as it is. So all right, hold on. Let me put on my nerd glasses and
do it, man.
Put my pocket protector in. So the parabolic antenna rotated at 1,200 rotations per minute. In search mode, the antenna nodded while rotating to scan a spiral pattern covering a 120-degree cone in front of the aircraft.
So let me jump in, Seth.
Go ahead.
So it's actually the transmitter, the little thing that sticks out on the parabolic antenna that rotated that fast. And then the reflector, the parabolic part, is the thing that nodded and shifted back and forth to give you a wider field of view for that radar. Go ahead, jump back in.
No, jump in, and you're the radar guy. I'm just going off my nerd search.
No, but it had a 120-degree cone in front of it, and what it did is kind of, that cone, you could get out to about 5 miles with that search cone. By the way, that little 2-inch display, those were very common in World War II. It's the same size display that submarines had, for example, in the early variants of the Identify Friend or Foe, or IFF. Scan things. So guys were used to looking at those tiny little A scans, or it's too small to be a PPI, but I think it was an A scan. But you had range settings of 1, 5, 25, and 65 miles on this thing. But believe me, by the way you do that is by narrowing the transmission cone. The narrower the transmission cone is, the farther out you could see. But trust me, you couldn't see 65 miles. It was a pipe dream at that range. And so the wider cone meant you've got a greater field of view, so you're less likely to be surprised by the incoming aircraft. Go back. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, for the sake of our listeners and also viewers, when we say a scope, think of an oscilloscope that, you get a blip, a peak of some sort on the waveform, and that gives you a bearing or something of that nature. But
a range,
a range.
It might not even give you a bearing. You may need the bearing from where you were pointing when you got that blip.
Right. So, as opposed to the view that we often think of when we're looking at a movie. We think of a PPI projector, which that has the sweeping. That is not what we're talking about in most of these radar displays in an aircraft.
Yeah, although, and again, sorry for this, but on submarines, their first air radar sets only gave you a range. It didn't give you a bearing. So you knew there was something out there at 30 miles.
Okay.
You had to get your lookouts to say, okay, now where is it? Where is it? So, yeah.
Okay. Pray continue, Seth.
Well, there's not much difference in this either, too, because it showed up on the screen, and these guys had to go hunt it down. It gave you a rough altitude guesstimation, if you will, not within feet, but within dozens of feet at the very least, and you still had to go find the damn thing.
Yeah.
It's not going to grow larger as it grows on the screen as you get closer, and like a homing beacon or anything like that. It's not going to do that. It's just telling you there's something somewhere out here. Go this way, and you might see it. Usually, you'd see engine exhaust, which would blow or glow blue or orange or whatever the case may be. But all of that is to say is that we had the ability to find, and I know the Japanese did introduce some night
They did.
radar kind of thing later.
Yeah, I was just gonna talk about that. Actually, one of the museums that we visit around Kagoshima, which is ostensibly a kamikaze museum, but they have the fuselage there of one of their Jake three-person float planes, and on that plane you can see that on the side of the fuselage on both sides it's got a Yagi antenna on it. So this was a plane that was used for night scouting. And this is one of the problems that the Americans have got throughout the later portion of the war, is that when our carrier forces get detected at night, there are invariably Japanese snoopers, running around the perimeter of that task force to keep tabs on it. And so one of the reasons we're developing these night fighters is we want to get rid of those suckers.
Exactly.
So do you know whether or not Grumman did any sort of modifications on these Hellcat night fighter variants to do things like dampening the exhaust?
I do not know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Because as you say, that is one of the telltales that gives you away. That was one of the modifications that the British did to a lot of their bombers, was to make them less detectable. You had to tamp down the exhaust gases. And that's one of the reasons that we were disinclined to be night bombers ourselves in Europe, is because the B-24 and the B-17 were not amenable to being dampened in that way, and they would have shown up like beacons at night. Anyway, nerding out.
I don't know. I don't know, but I do know that the Japanese certainly did not, because that's how the night fighters did shoot them down, is They would often see that exhaust. But as far as the F-6Fs are concerned, or the Corsairs, because there were also Corsair night fighters too, I have no earthly clue. I'm sure somebody does, but I do not. All that is to say is that we had the ability to hunt at night now. Yeah. And the reason that we had the ability, aside from the radar, were these night fighter pilots that Bill mentioned just a few minutes ago that were specially trained. Yes, they were fighter pilots for sure, but they were specially trained to operate and fly these night fighters. It was a 29-week training regimen after they got their wings. So this isn't like, while they're getting their wings. No. They've already got their wings of gold. They're already qualified fighter pilots. An additional 29 weeks of training is what these guys went through in order to become night fighters, and this course is Marines and Navy pilots.
Think about what that represents in terms of just the luxury of time, that our pilot training program at this point is so substantial that we can afford to take a chunk of that stream out and say, yeah, you're going to spend another half a year doing this thing, because we're graduating umpty thousand pilots a year at this point. That's something. Anyway.
It really is. It really is. And the overall ability of us to keep fighters, and not just fighters, but mainly fighters, airborne 24 hours a day, is a striking ability and a defensive capability that no other fleet in the entire world could ever possibly hope to have at this point. Yep. Which brings us to our next point.
Before you do that, Seth, if you want evidence that your Nord meter is pegged, we're 40 minutes into this podcast and we haven't dropped a bomb yet. So
I know.
we've been talking about radar. That's pretty cool.
God help us.
Another evolutionary aspect, and we've touched on this before, but this is incredibly important, is the loadout on U.S. Navy aircraft carriers at this point in the war. This is, again, February 1945, and this isn't when it first happens, but it's when it really first starts to show. 70%, roughly.
Or more.
Yeah, or more. And some carriers, it was more. Aboard the fleet carriers were fighters. 70% of the aircraft aboard these ships-ish were fighters. And that was specifically because of the threat from kamikazes. Combat air patrol fighters from the American Navy and the United States Marine Corps buzzed the fleet every hour, every day and night, 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
The Navy, good.
No, I was just going to say, no, I actually ran the math on this particular force. I mean, Spruance is bringing 1,087 aircraft to the party, and 895 of those are Hellcats. That means that 75% of this loadout on this fleet is fighters.
And
but
that's
to be fair,
impressive.
These were, we would have called them F&A sixes, in these days, right? Because these are fighters, but they could drop bombs too. They're multi-purpose,
And
so they weren't just anti-air, but yeah, if you were really worried about the kamikaze threat, you're going to have a whole lot more of these fighter attack aircraft than just attack.
Yeah. I mean, this is the beauty of having the Pratt & Whitney R2800. We've got a fighter now that has a 2,000 horsepower engine, which means it can haul a bomb, it can haul a big ass radar, it can do anything we need it to do. So there's fewer and fewer purpose-built attack planes at this point because the fighters can drop bombs, as you say.
And that's the important thing, is that the Hellcats and the Corsairs are becoming the jack of all trades. They're the only thing they can't carry is a torpedo. And it's just because the damn thing's just too damn big. But aside from that, they can carry bombs, they can carry napalm, they can carry, obviously they can carry machine gun ammunition, rockets out the wazoo. These things can, take out buildings, they can take out airfields, they can take out, bunkers, whatever, you name it. They can do just about everything that a Helldiver or an SBD could do back in 1942 and 43.
They are not as accurate from a bombing standpoint as a dive bomber. A dive bomber is still hands down the most accurate bombing platform out there. But from a utility standpoint, you got to have tons of fighters.
So the Navy did not have, we were pumping out fighter pilots, but we did not have an infinite amount of Navy fighter squadrons at this point. So enter the United States Marine Corps. The Corps is flying Corsairs at this point. And at this time in the war, the United States Navy is sucking some of those Marine Corps Corsair squadrons and putting them on their flat tops. USS Bennington, CV-20, USS Wasp, CV-18, Bunker Hill, CV-17, and Essex, CV-9, all had 2 Marine Corps fighter squadrons assigned to augment their own air groups. Nothing but Corsairs on these bad boys.
Yeah, Marine Corsairs on aircraft carriers, though, Second Lieutenant Eliminator doesn't just have the flair that Ensign Eliminator has, doesn't it?
Second Lieutenant Eliminator. It does not. It certainly does not. So examples of the fighter heavy strike on Japan shows in Randolph's flight log for February the 16th. She launched 109 fighters to only 14 Helldivers all day long. All day long. So on to the actual mission. Unlike earlier operations, roughly half of the aviators, Navy and Marine, aboard the carriers were new. Generally, the influx of new guys to old guys was about 70% old and about 30% new. Now it's about 50-50 because most of the old guys, not all of them by any means, obviously, but most of these older guys, they've gone back home because these are the guys that were flying through September, October, November, December, and January. These guys are just roasted. They're done. They're gone. They're back home. They're training their other people that are coming in, and at some point we're going to see them again. They're being promoted with inside the Navy. Now these veteran combat aviators are becoming squadron COs, squadron XOs, or even some of them are air group commanders, as you're going to see later. The new pilots, and then I put this in here in the notes, I'm going to call these guys like the 4th gen naval aviators of the war, because they I'd say 4th, maybe sometimes even 5th, maybe, I guess. These guys had been mostly trained by the guys from 42 and 43. So these guys have got stick time out the yin yang, many as 600 hours of stick time before they even get to the dang fleet. That's insane. That's
and
nuts.
we have the gasoline to do that, so why wouldn't you? And trainers out the yin yang, and
So Mitscher knows this. When he takes command of 58 again from McCain, he's aware that most of his aviators are new guys. He went to great pains to orient the new guys into the ways of the fleet. Pamphlets were sent. He had pamphlets written up and sent to all the carriers all across the fleet to talk about aircraft, ship identification, tactics, nothing that these guys aren't, receiving anyway, but he's just further emphasizing this. As they go north, as the fleet continues to go north and the weather starts to get colder, Remember, we're talking about secrecy here. Rumors and scuttlebutt are rampant throughout the ships. Some guys figured that a raid on northern Japan was in the offing, but others felt that a foray into the South China Sea was on the books again. Still, the target was kept secret, Bill, but as the fleet moves nearer the target, the weather, and we've talked about this before, guys, becomes an issue, doesn't it?
It does. Spruance had been concerned over the weather since being given the green light by Nimitz. I mean, he was I wouldn't say a witness, but he certainly was aware of Halsey's first typhoon. The second one hadn't happened yet. March was still winter in Japan. So you're not expecting typhoons in March, but this is going to be a different kind of weather threat now. As experienced by the B-29 crews, it was very finicky. Terrible weather had forced several cancellations of B-29 raids planned for the previous weeks. And of course, what we're talking about is overcast here. If the B-29s can't see the targets, they're not going to drop generally. Spruance had gone to great lengths to accurately predict the weather in the area and assumed that the unpredictable weather over Japan may just throw a wrench in the plans. But he had confidence because our weather guessers, our aerologists, in this case it's Captain McBurns, they're just so good. They're just so awesome that we're never surprised by weather. Right, Seth? John?
Yeah.
And as I say, this Burns guy is good, but he's no Costco.
There's no Costco.
He's no Costco.
Oh my God.
Yeah, unlike Costco, who is too busy planning operations to really think about typhoons, right?
Yeah.
This guy had no worries about operations at all because they're not going to be operating. They're just trying to outrun weather, aren't they?
That's it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sure. So as they're getting closer to Japan, weather reports from B-29s and submarines that were stationed off of Tokyo continued to be positive. So in other words, Captain Burns is looking at the weather reports and he's saying, hey, the weather's going to be pretty good. We should get clear skies here. He predicted a front and rain in the morning that should not hinder the raid. True to form, the weather on the morning of the 15th was absolutely terrible, which he predicted. Winds lashed the fleet and rain poured down in buckets. Spruance called it, and I quote, the damnedest, rottenest weather that I could think of, unquote. And while he cursed the weather, he also realized that the weather could be a good thing. If the bad weather kept his birds deck-bound, theoretically, it would also keep the Japanese birds deck-bound or on the ground anyway, and keep his fleet hidden from the Japanese, which of course it does. He was concerned over being discovered, as we talked about before, being so close to Japan and coming under an intense kamikaze attack. Intel estimates stated that as many as 500 Japanese aircraft were in the Tokyo region alone. And I think that's probably a low estimate, but I don't know.
Yeah, but I'm bringing 1,200 planes to the party. And I've faced up to this caliber of opposition before in the Marianas, and I crushed it. So am I concerned about 500 planes? Yeah, but I'm not intimidated by that, I don't think. Anyway, for what that's worth.
No. The kamikazes that's a different bird. It's
this is true,
intended.
But anyway.
Yeah. So finally, on the afternoon of the 15th, Spruance gives the word that is, all right, fine, tell everybody where we're going. Let them all know. So the news that the force is bound for Tokyo was, like, as you would imagine, electric. It sent shockwaves through the fleet. Everybody was excited. It's like, holy hell, we're hitting Tokyo. Everybody's aware it's the first time since the Doolittle Raid in 1942. We are going to hit not just Japan, Tokyo. And there's something symbolic about that for many, many reasons, obviously. So aboard USS Randolph, CV-15, we're going to talk about her a lot. This is her maiden combat voyage. The reaction was as expected. Quote, and this is from her cruise book, now the feeling began to get really tense. On the night of February 15th, Captain Baker spoke to us on the hangar deck. He told us that we were going to strike the homeland of Japan. Some of us stayed awake a while that night thinking about what would happen on this, our first assignment, as we tried to smash the enemy on his home grounds, unquote. Aboard USS Bella Wood, CVL-24, the reaction was similar, and I quote, the PA blared, attention all hands, this is the captain speaking. We are about 400 miles from Japan. You will be interested to know that we have as our destination Tokyo, which is also a great movie, by the way. Tomorrow afternoon, Yeah. Tomorrow afternoon, we will start our high-speed run in. At dawn on the 16th, we strike the capital. It was a sober crew when he finished. Everybody was a little uneasy, but at the same time, proud to be in on this one. You can understand that. I mean, this is a
Yep.
symbolic and important strike in terms of what these guys, your average Joe Blow aboard these American aircraft carriers, he doesn't care about the overall impact of the war. All he knows is he's going to be hitting Tokyo. And this is a big deal. This is certainly a big deal.
Yep.
So
Yeah, I don't think
go ahead, Bill.
they would have thought of it as symbolic, though, Seth, with 1,200 airplanes. Yeah, you can pack a pretty good punch.
Well,
Right?
symbolic in that they're striking the enemy capital is what I'm alluding to, is that they're
It's
hitting
true. Yeah.
Tokyo itself. So the nervous energy gave way to gloom as the thought of the heavy AAA and waves of Japanese fighters flooded the minds of the mostly untested aviators. As such, Mitscher sent a message to his flyboys that read, and I quote, "The large majority of VF pilots in Task Force 58 will engage in air combat for the first time over Tokyo. First time over Tokyo. This fact will not be too great a handicap if pilots will remember the fundamentals and keep calm. Try not to get too excited. Remember that your airplane is superior to the Japanese in every way. He's probably more afraid of you than you are of him. Stick together in formation and do not chase individual enemy aircraft. When you sight your first enemy, resist the impulse to follow your first individual reaction. If you're a wingman, follow your section leader and never leave him," unquote. Wise words, but as we're going to see, that's not always what happens. Bill, tell us
No
about what
plan.
happens the night before the raid here on February 16th.
Yeah, no plan survives contact with the enemy, Seth.
Mm-mm.
The old saying, right? The night before the raid, the intel officers briefed the men on what they may encounter over Tokyo. Heavy AAA was expected, as were previously mentioned, 500 or so Japanese aircraft. The targets for the pilots were to be the airfields around Tokyo, of which there are 24. The first sweep in would eliminate and pin down any of the Japanese air response, the fighter sweep, as it is going to be called, or some pilots called it the Mitscher shampoo. I'm going to wash your hair with some Mitscher shampoo. It had become de rigueur for the fast carriers since the introduction of the kamikaze. Following the fighter sweep, the strikers would target the factories that the B-29s had tried to destroy in vain for the last 2 months from a nice altitude of 30,000 feet. The Takikawa engine plant in Tama and the Nakajima airframe factory in Ota in southern Tokyo by the bay, kind of close to Yokohama, both of these targets were deemed high priority by LeMay's command, but as yet had not been touched in any major way. Minimal damage had been done to the plants in over 12 raids so far. Spruance, as mentioned before, felt that his strike fighters could get the job done. So the flip side of this, though, was that because they would be coming in low, just as Jon Parshall said an hour ago, the Japanese AAA would be far more accurate and could inflict significant damage if they had responded quickly enough, guys.
So,
I was
yeah,
going to ask you to jump in.
Yeah. Throughout this series, of course, we've had a tendency to kind of poo-poo Japanese AAA because on their ships it was not all that great.
Right.
I was just reading a master's thesis last night that was talking about how the Japanese finally, during the Battle of Saipan, mated up radar effectively with their anti-aircraft defenses, and they were very effective. During the Battle of Saipan, the Americans lost 81 aircraft at Saipan and Tinian alone, most of them downed by low-level AAA, but in some cases also medium caliber. You know, the Japanese had a lot of these 120 millimeter 4.7-inch guns that they used in an anti-aircraft role too. There were 4 radar stations on Saipan that were directing this fire. And obviously, you know, you take that sort of general model and you replicate it and the nation's capital, there's going to be a lot of radar systems here, and there's a lot of AAA, a lot of 25 millimeter flak. 25 millimeter can't obviously reach up 30,000 feet to a B-29, but if you're a TBF coming in, or a fighter doing a sweep, it can sure as hell reach out and touch you. And this is going to be a feature for all of these raids, that are going to continue on through this war. When we talk about Halsey coming back and attacking Kure later in the war, holy Moses, the Japanese have got a lot of flack there. So the Japanese are no longer a walkover when it comes to the AAA environment that they can put together here in the late stage of the war.
No, absolutely. And that's a perfect point, because when we talked about the South China Sea raids, when Halsey brings the fleet down there and just runs wild through the South China Sea, the last raid in that area before he hits Formosa again on the way out is, I think, was it Hong Kong or Shanghai? I forget which one it was now. I think it was Hong Kong. But the AAA over there was said by those aviators, and again, these are the same guys that have been flying since September, said that was the heaviest anti-aircraft fire they had ever seen in their lives over this port, because it was just, they said, it was so thick you could taxi on it, as the old saying as it is. It was incredible. And we lost a lot of aircraft in that area due to anti-aircraft fire. So exactly to your point.
Yeah, what you're seeing there is the effect of radar finally being added into the Japanese mix here. It's not just a question of automatic weapons, it's that they have got a decent fire control radar, which gives not only bearing and azimuth and all that good stuff, but the altitude too. So yeah, these batteries are locked in before the Americans even get there.
And we're going to see that they do indeed inflict some damage. So as the fleet nears the Tokyo area, the local radio station, NHK, kept broadcasting, which told Spruance at that point that, clearly they don't know that we're here, because if the radio station is still kicking out tunes, then it's very evident that they have no idea that we're here. So to that end, go ahead.
The analog to Fuchida listening to the Hawaiian radio station on the way in for Pearl Harbor, right?
Exactly.
Talk about, the tables have been turned. Anyway.
Yeah, no, totally true. Totally true. So much to
I don't think NHK was playing Gabi Pai Nui, though, Hawaiian music.
Could well be.
You never know. Never know. Yeah. So much to Spruance's chagrin, the weather that had been predicted to be somewhat favorable on the morning of the launch was horrendous. It was absolutely terrible. Rain is just beating down on these flight decks, pelting the flight deck crews. Howling winds are driving across the American aircraft carriers, which is good for takeoff because it's going to get you up in the air pretty fast, but it's not very good for just about anything else. The cloud cover that was over the fleet was expected to be the same over Tokyo. What was the cloud cover? It was a ceiling of only 4,000 feet. That is not good. That's not good weather. The flying would be difficult at best, but Mitscher urged Spruance to go ahead with the launch because they had gone this far. They were this close. It's like, you can't come this far and then not do anything. You got to do something. So Spruance approved the decision and the raid was on. They launched roughly 125 miles from Tokyo, but only 60 miles from the Honshu coast. Task Force 58 was absolutely in Hirohito's backyard, and they had no friggin' clue. 60 miles off the coast of Japan, the Japanese had no idea. Over 1,100 aircraft are launched from the carriers, all heading north through the pea soup. As Randolph's 47 F-6Fs of VF-12 headed up for high cover, they popped into clear skies at 14,000 feet, but they couldn't see anything beneath them except the gray clouds. We said that half of their aviators were new. Well, the other half aren't. And this is one of them, VF-12 Ace Hamilton Mac McWhorter. Odd name, but I like it. Ham McWhorter. I can dig on that. Made note of the sleet pelting his windscreen on his Hellcat. He was one of the cadre aboard Randolph's as yet untested VF-12. Bill, tell us a little bit about McWhorter and the
So he's from
suite.
Georgia. Yeah, he's from Georgia. He's notable for the fact that he became the U.S. Navy's first Hellcat ace, scoring his first kill over Wake Island on USS Essex maiden combat sortie. Over truck in Operation Hailstone, Mac shot down 3 Japanese aircraft, bringing a score to 10. 10? 3 plus 1 is 10? No, he shot down other airplanes too. So not only was Mac the first Hellcat ace, He was the first Hellcat double ace. The fighter sweep crossed the Japanese coastline near Chiba, just south of Yokohama. The clouds began to break up somewhat, and one section of Essex Hellcats spotted a Betty Low on the surface. And so now they're able to see through the clouds somewhat. Streaking down, Lieutenant J.G. E.J. Nicolini, your grandfather's neighbor, Seth?
Yeah.
Really?
I put that in the notes. I swear to God. I knew that the guy was in the Navy. Yeah, I knew he was in the Navy. And not until writing this episode did I see the name. And I'm like, what? I started doing some digging. And yeah, my grandfather's next door neighbor for 50 years was E.J. Nicolini, who shot down the first Japanese aircraft over Tokyo.
Huh.
The things you don't know.
My goodness.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how to continue from that. I mean, it's just incredible. Small world. We've said that 1,000 times.
Yeah.
But it is a small world. Well, your grandfather's neighbor, Uncle Nicolini, drew first blood on that day, shooting the Japanese bomber down in one pass, not far behind the double ace. Mac McWhorter spotted a lone zero, dove on him, and shot him down. Before the day's end, Mac would claim another enemy aircraft, bringing his tally to 12. Lieutenant Commander Herb Houck and Lexington's Hellcats, along with Hancock and San Jacinto's fighters, ran into some of the heaviest air action of that early sweep. The swirling dogfight acted as sort of an airplane tornado as fighters, both American and Japanese, piled into the fur ball. You know, we love those fur balls. When aviators do anyway, they're always shooting at their watches with their hand signals. Lieutenant Commander Pete Keith, CO of Hancock's VF-80, blew 5 Japanese planes out of the air to become an ace in a day. That doesn't happen very often. One of Keith's section leaders, 31-year-old former SPD pilot Lieutenant Bill Edwards, also became an ace in a day, shooting down 5 as well, Seth.
Yeah. This is one of those instances. The Japanese don't necessarily respond very quickly to this raid, but in this one section of coastline, they certainly do. The combat, the aerial melee, was about 30 minutes long, and in that 30 minutes, Americans claimed 48 kills. Exaggerated claims, to be sure. There is no question about this, and we'll get to those numbers in just a minute. But the end result was, the most important thing is that the Hellcats and later Corsairs drove the Japanese out of the air in this particular section of Japanese airspace, and therefore owned the skies over Katori and further north. Follow-up sweeps by Hellcats and Corsairs found the skies pretty well clear over Tokyo. So, John, let's dig into this a little bit. Now, we're going to talk about some of these veteran aviators in Japan later, but a lot of these guys are not veterans. These are new, and they are a little reluctant to get into the scrum.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, too, that by this point in time, well, I'm trying to put in my mind here, when did the formal orders for Operation Ketsugo get issued? It's really not until March. The bottom line is that a lot of the Japanese aircraft are actually in the south of the country, and that there's certainly a fair number of aircraft here in around Tokyo, but there's thousands that are elsewhere. So I'm not necessarily all that surprised that they didn't find that many planes over Tokyo itself. To your larger point around crew quality, yeah, that's absolutely the truth at this point. I mean, there are very few experienced aviators left in the Japanese inventory, and a lot of those guys are being concentrated into sort of elite squadrons at this point to try to preserve them, and we'll be talking about one of them a little bit later.
So while the dogfights are always fun to talk about, and they are, that was not the main reason for the American strikes. Yorktown CV-10 strikers came in and found that the AAA was as expected. This is exactly what you were talking about. As one pilot remarked, quote, "The flak was pedestrian. It was so thick you could walk on it," unquote. Nevertheless, Yorktown's Hellcats bored in, firing rockets at parked Japanese aircraft on an airfield near Osaka. The aircraft, and this is, further proof that they never expected us to be here, were parked neatly on the airfield's apron, almost wingtip to wingtip, a la Pearl Harbor, making them easy
Was MacArthur in charge of Japan at this point? Okay,
not quite yet.
Not yet. After 3 passes, the Yorktown pilots claimed 9 destroyed and a further 21 damaged. However, the real prize of the day were the 2 factories that the 29ers could not touch. The Bunker Hill Strike Group from Air Group 84, they were the first Navy aircraft over Tokyo, targeted the Nakajima factory. They scored very well, setting the target afire and dealing significant damage to the untouched target. And I say untouched, and it had been damaged slightly in some of these B-29 raids, but it was not knocked out. And hence the reason they keep coming back to it is they're trying to knock it out, and they simply can't at this point. They came in again. Bunker Hill's people came in again that afternoon, hitting the same target. Air Group 84, quote, finished off the factory, but came under air attack, losing 4 aircraft due to Japanese fighter activity. Spruance, who had been monitoring the pilots' radio traffic all day from Indianapolis, was aware that the weather had played hell with the pilots all day long, not allowing them to find the targets and obscuring large targets such as airfields. No lie, the weather was that bad. The weather had been that bad all day, and by the afternoon, Mitscher called it quits, and the fleet pulled out of here. More strikes would follow. Ugaki is a guy that we've talked about before. We're going to talk about him again, but he makes note of this, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. So, his diary is one of those sort of go-tos that any Pacific War historian is going to use if you want to get some perspective from the Japanese. And yeah, per his diary, Ugaki says, in spite of repeated warnings that an enemy would come, the Kanto district, the Kanto plain being Tokyo, was subjected at last to the enemy's surprise attack, with the results that the Army and Navy planes destroyed on the ground added up to 150. Other damages inflicted on installations and vessels will be fairly big, too. It's most regrettable to see that little improvements have been made in defective patrols and reconnaissance. So Ugaki, as per usual, not a happy camper as a result of all of this. One of the things I wanted to point out here, just talking about these aviator reports, that, yeah, we finished off the factory. No, you didn't. No, you didn't.
Not at all.
And it's the same thing with airfields, too. And this is the thing that we've seen throughout the war is that airfields in particular are incredibly resilient targets. You shovel some dirt into the runway or do whatever you have to do. You can patch that thing up and it's back in action, in the afternoon. And factories are a little more finicky in that you've got things like machine tools inside them and whatnot. But if there's anything that the bombing campaign in Europe proved, it's that you can hit these factories in some cases dozens of times and they'll still be back in production. So what you've got here is your typical over exuberant carrier aviators like, yeah, we put a bomb in there. My God, it's all over. It's like, no. You may have slowed down their production a little bit, and that's good. That's great. But this isn't war winning by any stretch of the imagination.
Not even close. And you see that, to your point, you see that in Germany. I could be wrong here, but I don't think I am. There was never a factory that was completely shut down and destroyed. Destroyed maybe for a couple of months.
Right.
But like even Regensburg on August 17th, 43, when it was hit, during a double strike, it got pounded. And
yeah.
I mean, they really did put a licking on it, and they knocked it out of action for a period of time, but it came back. It was kind of like a lizard growing another tail. It's going to come back sooner or later. You're never going to completely render it inoperative until you either advance past it or just wipe it off the face of the map, which didn't happen very often then.
Yeah. And the Japanese are doing the same thing that the Germans were doing. They were dispersing their production facilities. They're moving them into smaller facilities or into tunnels in the hills or what have you. And it's just, I don't want to say it's a pinprick. I mean, this is the nature of attritional warfare. You have to keep chipping away at these things to, notch down their aircraft production, among other things. But it's very, very difficult to, finish off a factory. That never happens.
The key, I guess, to take away from all this is that they were able to hit it, which is something that the B-29ers couldn't do.
Couldn't do.
And while they didn't knock it out permanently, because as we're going to see, if you listen to any of the ones that we're going to do about strategic bombing and then really to the end of the war, these factories are going to continue to operate, but at a lesser capacity than they had been previous. So they're never going to stop.
Yeah.
They're going to slow down maybe at some point. But regardless of this, they're there to knock out these factories as best they can. The next day, which is February 17th, 1945, the weather that had been bad the day before on the 16th was actually worse now. So the wind had died down somewhat, but the rain was atrocious at this point. The targets for the day were the industrial targets in Tokyo. They were no longer the airfields to an extent. They were still going to do the fighter sweeps, but not like they had done the day before. Low clouds hung over the target area, which for this day was the Tachikawa factory that we mentioned earlier. Using Mount Fuji as a landmark, the pilots pressed their attacks through the clouds, passing directly over the Imperial Palace. That had to make Hirohito
Oh my
go,
God.
oh, good God.
Yeah, well, and his handlers too. Just from a propaganda standpoint, of course, the Japanese people have been told since the beginning of this war that the home islands would never be threatened, that our coastlines are inviolate. And so yeah, that's a real eye opener.
Yeah, not so much.
We'd taken Hirohito's palace and many of the temples in Kyoto and places like that off of the target list by this point.
Yeah, Kyoto had already been taken off the target list as a result of Secretary of War Stimson, also input from the former ambassador to Japan, Ambassador Grew. As for the Imperial Palace, though, it does end up getting damaged later on during the war, but we're not going to deliberately target it or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. So. It was not on the target list for the Navy aircraft that day, even though they could have absolutely pummeled it if they wanted to.
It's a pretty big target,
Yeah.
You look at sort of the road map in Tokyo. It's
with a big moat around it.
Yeah,
in case you're wondering, right?
Yeah,
still has
right.
the moat and the cherry trees. It's just
yeah. At one point in time, this was in the 1980s when the real estate market in Japan was at its zenith. The land that the Imperial Palace sat on was worth more than all the real estate in Manhattan. It's a pretty big chunk of change. Anyway.
Goodness. So San Jacinto's Avengers came in low in a glide run with their bombs on this factory again. They held their release until the absolute last moment. The Tachikawa factory at this point does suffer heavy damage from Sanjak's strike and others that followed, rendering the factory inoperative for several weeks. Key point, several weeks, not several months or even years. However, the day's weather worsened, and by 11:30, Mitscher received a call from Spruance. The latter informed the former that they were pulling out. In other words, Spruance is like, let's go. Come on, this ain't working out. Let's just get the hell out of here. They were very frustrated, both of them, for obvious reasons, as they had brought all this beefy firepower to go over there and lay waste to the Japanese capital, and they can't, not because of Japanese resistance or defensive fire, because of the stinking weather. They can't get through there and hit the targets that they want to and operate with the conveyor belt consistency that they're used to because of the damn weather. So the first U.S. Navy strikes, and we don't really say this very often. We said this, off camera during the break here a minute ago, that usually we say that the U.S. Navy or the Army Air Forces, pummel these targets. Not so much here. This was a big hyped up operation that turned out to be, frankly, a disappointment, a severe disappointment in the eyes of Spruance and especially Mitscher. Mitscher was really fuming at the fact that he could not get his people in there. So what Japanese fighters did rise to greet the American invaders, for the most part, and we talked about this briefly, refused combat. Those that chose to fight, however, put up a hell of a fight. They really did. The U.S. Navy aircraft losses for both days, February 16th and 17th, tallied in at 82 aircraft. That is not an insignificant number in any way, shape, or form. 60 of those 82 were lost due to combat damage, either AAA or air-to-air combat. The rest were accidents or operational losses, putting them down in the water or whatever the case may be. In February 1945 alone, however, even though we suffered a loss of 82 aircraft, factories in the United States pumped out over 300 Corsairs and nearly 600 Hellcats just in February 1945. So while, John, you say 7% attrition rate, that is a significant number, but we could absorb that rate
Sure.
at this is the key.
Sure.
So Japanese losses were claimed at 341 aircraft. As we know, as you just said just a minute ago, Ugaki admits the loss of 150. And that
On
was
the ground.
That was on the ground. Okay, that's what I was going to ask you.
And so there definitely were more shot down. And as you say, the somewhere between those two numbers is probably the reality of 225 or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So, as I said, the raids on Tokyo, these first ones were frustrating, but they proved two things. The United States Navy could and would own the skies over Japan, which was obviously humiliating to the empire and especially the citizenry of Tokyo. You talked about this. You touched on this a few minutes ago. Because the Japanese people are looking up and they know what these blue airplanes are. They know that these are not, United States Army Air Forces airplanes. These are U.S. Navy carrier aircraft, and they had to come from somewhere, which means this whole malarkey that the Japanese propaganda machine has been spitting out for years is just wrong. Yeah, it's wrong.
Yeah.
So Spruance orders the Fifth Fleet to head for Iwo. He had landings to protect, of course, this is February 19th. He would pay the Emperor a call soon enough. And it's something I didn't put in the notes, but I want to mention. The two night carriers that were out here were Enterprise and Saratoga. Saratoga takes the place of Independence, who had been rotated back into regular carrier operations, daytime carrier ops. Saratoga, we've talked about before. She had a star-crossed career during World War II. She really did, man. I mean, you kind of feel bad for the damn thing. Her only real claim to fame is the Rabaul carrier raids, in which she performed, exemplary, exemplary work. However, true to her past, poor thing, she gets out there, she performs her night ops. She really doesn't do a whole lot during these night ops at Tokyo because there's really nothing to shoot at too much. However, she gets off the coast of Iwo Jima and she suffers, I think it's either 4 or 5 bomb hits and a kamikaze hit, and puts her out of the war. It's like the thing can't stay out of the yard. So Saratoga is one of the, if there ever was a hard luck carrier.
Yeah, for our fleet, it's kind of her. Yeah. I kind of wonder too if one of the reasons that they took her out of day carrier operations and did night stuff instead, her elevators, that was one of the problems with that class of carriers. Their elevators were just atrocious, and you're not going to need the same kind of rapid cycles for elevators for doing night fighter ops as you are for launching mainline strikes anyway. But yeah, she's out.
100%. No, that's 100% exactly why they put Saratoga in there in that position, because she was just there. She wasn't really doing much of anything at this point in the war. She had done some operations with the Brits in the Pacific.
Yeah.
But Independence, now this will tell you all you need to know. Independence, a light carrier, was seen as more valuable in terms of day-to-day flight operations than the fleet carrier Saratoga, because of the fact that she could put up those conveyor belt-like operations that the Big Blue Fleet had been doing since 1944, since the beginning of 44. Sarah, to your point, and I swear to God, it's because of her elevators, could not operate at that up tempo that every other carrier, including Enterprise, could. So therefore, at night, you're not going to have to put up, your air group 5 times. Right. You only got to put up a small squadron once or twice. Yeah. So she could do that.
Yeah. One thing I do want to say, though, as a coda, though, before we leave Tokyo, as it were, is that, the guys had to, this is several months after Battle of Philippine Sea, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, some of these guys were expecting this to become the Honshu turkey shoot. And when it wasn't that, because you got to think of several months worth of attrition of Japanese experienced pilots and all that have happened since Phil C. When it wasn't that, it has to have been disappointing at some level, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I could see that actually. Yeah, we're expecting these great results, and we're just going to massacre the opposition, and yeah, it's very anticlimactic. So
very, very much so. And I mean that's why I said, Spruance, especially Mitscher, was like very, very frustrated at the results of both of these attacks that they launched. And I mean, the fact that he had to pull out because of the weather, that had to have irritated him to no, and I'm talking about Marc Mitscher, that had to irritate him to no end, because if he was nothing else, he was a scrappy little dude. Like, he wanted to fight. And he brought all this beef up there, and he couldn't put it to the use that, frankly, he, above all else, knew how to do. And he couldn't do it. So it stemmed from the top. If he was irritated, those fighter jocks and those Avenger drivers were just as miffed about the whole operation as he was. All right. So as frustrating as the initial American carrier raids on Japan, and specifically the Tokyo area, had been, that is not going to keep Raymond Spruance from wanting to hit them, or Marc Mitscher from wanting to hit them yet again. So in the middle of the Iwo Jima operation, specifically middle of March, Task Force 58 goes back to Ulithi for rest and replenishment. And when they leave again, March 10th to be exact, they leave again. They're heading where? Right back to Japan, but not to Honshu this time. They're going to Kyushu this time. Their job is to hammer the airfields in the home islands in an attempt to blunt any aerial response or buildup. John, we're going to talk about this in a minute, before the Okinawa invasion set for April the 1st. Yes, we're jumping around. We're jumping to several weeks ahead. I'm sorry, I said they left Ulithi on March 10th. They leave Ulithi on March 14th. My bad. They sailed at full speed towards the Empire. He hoped for surprise, like he had achieved, Spruance did, like he'd achieved at Tokyo. But unlike his earlier strikes in February, surprise would not be on his side. In the approach to the coast, American radar picked up Japanese snoopers shadowing the fleet. Night fighters from Enterprise were sent to shoot the invaders down, which they did. But several more stalked the fleet all night long, dropping flares around the outer edges of the American formation. How friggin' spooky is that?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, we see you. And
yeah.
We're going to let you know that we see you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All night long.
All night long.
So ashore, Japanese Admiral Ugaki, now this is on Kyushu, had monitored the reported sightings and planned a strike of his own. And this is something we need to talk about here. Ugaki's patrols had picked up the fleet and were aware that a heavy raid would probably fall in his area the next day. Ugaki's in Kanoya in the main airfield there. Now, he had been told to basically husband his forces and not necessarily launch an all-out strike against the Americans should they just come with a carrier raid. As the Japanese said, just a carrier raid. But Ugaki he's not going to listen.
No, he's not going to listen, and that's very true to form for the Japanese as a whole. If you've got a reasonable target to attack, you're going to go after it with everything that you've got, pretty much. It's interesting, though, at this point in the war, what you're seeing is that there's this real bifurcation in terms of Japanese air power, that they are, as much as possible, husbanding their remaining good pilots and only sending the chaff. The noobs are going into the kamikaze corps. And that makes a certain amount of sense, too, because we always think of these kamikaze raids as being just monolithic and that they're all kamikazes, but that's never the case. No. Usually you're going to have some better aviators that are guiding these kamikaze pilots into the target, in some cases running top cover as well. So, the Japanese do still have some respectable strike capabilities left within their ranks. It's diminishing, but there's still enough here in the gas tank, if you will, that Ugaki is willing to try to attack this fleet as it's coming in.
And to that end, he again disobeys orders straight up and is like, no, if the Americans are here, we're going to hit them. Yeah. So he starts bringing people down from all over the home islands to this area to do this very thing, to hit the Americans, which he knows he's not stupid. He knows that they're coming and they're going to come hit him. Now, do we need to? I think we should probably remind people who Admiral Ugaki was at this point. John, he was
Yeah,
He's been around a while.
he's one of these recurring dramatis personae that we see throughout the Pacific War. I mean, he starts out as Yamamoto's right-hand man, as chief of staff for combined fleet. Um, we saw him at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He was in command of Battleship Division 1. And now he's back into an air billet here in Japan, is in charge of this particular command area that's got aircraft that can defend against a fleet threat like this. So yeah, he's all over the place.
Yeah. So following Ugaki's orders, the Japanese on the following morning launched 2 attack forces, bombers and fighters armed with bombs between 0350 and 0600. As a result, the incoming United States Navy and Marine Corps fighters that are coming in to strike encountered little to no aerial resistance at this point from the Japanese. Bill, take us through what's going down next.
So, looking for the fighters to shoot down, finding none, the Americans concentrated on airfields, hangars, facilities, all on Kyushu. The strikers hit the selected targets hard, with the weather being the opposite of what it was over Tokyo. The weather here was cooperating. We got Keivu, ceiling and visibility unlimited. Further strikes that afternoon targeted some 45 Japanese airfields further inland, with clear weather and orders from Ugaki to defend the skies. I think this is the area around Fukuoka and places like that. The Japanese rose to fight in large numbers. The air battle that had been desired over Tokyo finally is found over Kyushu. Hornets VF-17 under the command of Lieutenant Commander Marshall Beebe was the most heavily engaged of the day. The fight his group was in was over Kanoya, directly over Ugaki, this guy we've been talking about. In a running dogfight over the airfield, Lieutenant Commander Beebe engaged and destroyed, I think it was 5 Japanese aircraft. In the swirling fight, Beebe recalled the Japanese just kept coming. Every time he would pull around to get a bead on an enemy aircraft, several more would pop up in his windscreen. Now I'm pronouncing the name Beebe because I knew an Admiral Beebe when I was stationed in Pearl Harbor. Now I'm wondering if they were related.
It's a possibility. It's a possibility. So this is one of those aircraft tornadoes that we were talking about before and over Tokyo, but this one's significantly larger. As these fighters are literally whirling around after one another, the Japanese just keep piling these people into this fight. A direct quote from Beebe says, and it went on just like that, in a real melee, except that every time I pulled out from a run or somebody else pulled out from a run, there was one of those guys just sitting. We worked in an area of about, couldn't have been more than 5 miles, just back and forth. And every time we came out of a run, well, here was some guy sitting out there, and here would be another one. You'd go after him. Well, then some more came. We were getting we were getting in pretty good shape. We had 6, 8, 9, 10 planes down by this time. So it's a running fight at this point. However, the Japanese are not slouches in this area. Beebe's fight is an example of many that occurred this specific day. Marine Corsairs from VMF 112 flying from USS Bennington tangle with a large flight of Zeros over Kanoya after Beebe's people pulled out of here. In their fight, the Marines claimed an additional 12 kills. The dogfights of the day netted some, clearly mistyped this. I put 1,026 Japanese aircraft. Clearly not the case.
Pretty good shooting.
That's some damn good shooting. I think it's more
Really
along the lines 126 Japanese aircraft shot down and a further 200 destroyed on the ground. While usually those claims are massively inflated and need to be taken with a grain of salt, the Japanese admitted to losing 102 on the day, so it wasn't terribly far off. John, this is something I've been wanting to talk about. Ugaki brings some of his better aviators down to this fight, as we talked about earlier. Not all of these attackers are kamikazes, as you were saying. Conventional bombing attacks are made all over Task Force 58. So while American fighters are hitting Japanese airfields over Kanoya, The Japanese are hitting our carriers, and this is a running fight throughout the day.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I wanted to mention here too is that we're talking about this as if it is strictly a Japanese Navy kind of fight, and that ain't true either.
Mhm.
Because if you look at Kagoshima and its environs, Kanoya is right on the eastern side of the bay that Kagoshima sits on, where there's this active volcano right in the middle of that bay. Kanoya is an old Japanese Navy aviation base. A number of its air groups were based there for its carriers. But right across the bay in Kagoshima near Chiran, there's a big Army aviation base, and they certainly must have been involved in some of this stuff as well. So there's a lot of Army aviators down here too, and in some cases, these guys are using pretty advanced aircraft as well. The Ki-84, the Frank, which is a late model Japanese fighter, very fast, very maneuverable. It's the fastest fighter in their inventory during the war, and that's an Army fighter, and is capable of giving as good as it gets from most contemporary American fighters at this point. So there's, again, the opposition is very mixed, but when you do run into some of these better units, yeah, they can put up a pretty fierce struggle against anything that we can throw at them.
There's going to be a unit we're going to talk about here in just a couple minutes that certainly does that. However, the attacks on the American fleet, and this goes back there, not everything's kamikaze in 1945.
Right.
You know, in our general idea of the Pacific War, and at this point, March 1945, we think, and I say we as Westerners think, that every single attack on a fleet is somebody throwing their airplane into an American ship. And that is not the case at all. Not even close. So Task Force 58 is sailing under a low cloud ceiling at this point. Yes, the weather is clear over Kyushu, but not so good over the American fleet. They were hidden from altitude observation. In other words, the Japanese necessarily can't see them through the clouds, but they know that they're there, obviously. I mean, there's 116 some odd warships out there.
Right.
Despite being picked up on radar, so the Americans, we're picking these guys up as they're coming in. They could not find them because the Japanese are going into these clouds and they're just hanging out. They know the fleet's down there. They're just hanging out. And if, again, what Bill has said before, you can't kill them if you can't see them. So even though the radar is saying, hey, they're up there, you can't find them to shoot them down. And the Japanese are just hanging out, waiting for their moment. And this is one of those moments. Enterprise, my beloved Enterprise, is hit with one bomb that temporarily disables the ship. Intrepid is also hit by large pieces of a crashing Betty that exploded close aboard, holing her hull and starting fires. The American fleet, had been under attack throughout the day, but the constant and large presence of American combat air patrol kept most of the attackers away, but not all. And as we see, it only takes one or two. Yeah. At 1500, 3 Judy dive bombers made an approach on USS Yorktown. The first 2 Judys are shot down by the ship's AAA, but the third make a successful attack and land a bomb smack on top of Yorktown's signal bridge. The weapon passes through the thin armor and enters the first deck, exploding next to her hull. 2 large holes are blown in Yorktown's side, with the resulting explosion killing 5 men and wounding a further 26. Despite the damage, considered to be moderate by the Americans, she remained on station and continued operations once the fires were extinguished. So we're getting some significant damage done to our ships as we're dealing damage out. Yeah. The fighting over Kyushu had been heavier than expected, much heavier than it had been over Tokyo, and the desired effect was achieved in terms of knocking down some of this fight over these airfields. But the Americans had kicked up a hornet's nest that would indeed turn around and sting them the next day. Bill, tell us about the 19th of March.
Yeah, and remember, folks, the Japanese know this is an attack on their homeland. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of the final death throes of sorts, right? So Japanese snoopers and American night fighters are busy all night long. General quarters was sounded aboard the American ships all night long. So there's no time to sleep here. You're always at GQ. Almost as soon as the crews were taken off battle stations to get food and rest, sandwiches called soup down, where you get some soup and sandwiches. The GQ alarm sounds again. That's what it's called. Bringing the exhausted sailors back to their stations for the remainder of the night and morning. Ugaki, if nothing else, true to his word of fighting hard, sent more strikes at the Americans on the 19th. Early in the morning, Wasp was hit by a conventional attack in which a 500-pounder penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the galley where many of the crew were eating breakfast after having been at GQ all night. The explosion killed 101 of her crew and started fires near her avgas lines. Remember, this would be death knell early in the war. But the DC parties this time had the fires under control, and Wasp was launching aircraft 27 minutes after being hit. This is incredible, folks. Worst of all, of course, was Franklin. Hit with a single bomb in another conventional attack, Franklin was gutted by the resulting explosions and fires. So I think it's important to talk about this one, Seth.
Yeah, it is, but we're not going to do that here.
Yeah, Franklin, he gets her own episode because it's just such an ordeal.
She does. She does. So if people are going, why aren't they talking about Franklin? Yeah, just
we will.
Cool your jets. We will.
That's
we
right.
will. Yeah, that's a whole nother story
like
for all
spiking the football. That's not fair. All right. So Ugaki's pledge to deploy his best came again true. It came true when the 343rd Naval Air Group, led by none other than Genda Minoru, engaged Marine Corps sailors flying from Bennington near the Kure Harbor. Boy, oh boy, that's a mouthful. Flying the nimble, strong, and robust Kawanishi N-1K Shiden, the squadron of aces ambushed the Americans and took them to task. I gotta think you know something about this, John.
Well, obviously, Genda has been around the block, right? He was a noted fighter pilot in his own right. He had a thing called Genda's Flying Circus before the war. This was a Navy acrobatic unit that would go around Japan, putting on displays to get more men to sign up for the Navy. So yeah, Genda is a very, very bright operator, and he gets permission at the end of the war to assemble this unit that is composed of the very best of the remaining aces and other quality aviators within the Japanese Navy. So 343, known as the 343rd Coup for Kokutai, has, this is the creme de la creme at this point, and they've got the best fighter in the Navy, which is the Shiden, Purple Lightning. This is it's a very good plane. It's powered by the late model Homare engine. It's, when the engine runs, and that's the problem, it's a real finicky beast. But when this plane can get off the ground, it's very fast. It's got a roll rate of 82 degrees per second. So it's super, super nimble. And it's armed to the teeth. It's got 4 20-millimeter cannons. It's pretty heavily armored. It doesn't climb real well, but it's, like I say, it's super maneuverable. It's very fast. And in the hands of a skilled practitioner, it can be a very formidable opponent. This thing can go toe-to-toe with a Corsair or a Hellcat, no problem at all. And they've got some very good pilots in the mix. I'm looking for the name. Muto Kanayoshi is in here. This is a guy that's going to be credited with 25 kills or thereabouts before he ends up dying very near the end of the war. There are other aces in the mix here too. A guy named Kano Naoshi, who also has about 25 kills to his name. So these are very, very formidable cats, and they do put up a very good fight against the first fighters that run into them.
They put up a good fight. In my opinion, they put a whipping on these Americans that are coming through there. They really do, because 20 Japanese fighters hit these guys from the side and behind. Is clearly a tactic they had worked out and planned. Boxing the Corsairs in, sending 2 down in the very, very first pass. And the Americans don't even know what the hell's going on. They're flying along, and then whammo, they get slammed from 2 sides by these Japanese fighters. As I put in the notes, it was pretty clear to the Americans that these guys that they were fighting were professionals. These were not some novice. These guys knew what the hell they were doing. The first wave of attackers were led by the guy you just talked about, Lieutenant Kano Naoshi. He was a squadron commander. They maintained section integrity, excellent marksmanship. They were clearly knew what the hell they were doing. In the fight, the Japanese shot down 6 Corsairs and lost only 3 of their own in 1 pass.
Yeah, we ain't used to that.
Not at all. Not at all. After beating away Bennington's Corsairs, and they did force these Marine-driven Corsairs to get out of Dodge, Kano turned the fight to Yorktown's Hellcats that were coming in, that were strafing his home airfield. Despite flying an aircraft that was missing an aileron, Kano engaged the lead F-6F piloted by Lieutenant Bert Eckerd and missed. As he went by, he literally did like one flashing past, shot at Eckerd and pulled out and missed. And Eckerd was on him like flies on, Kano pulled around to get on the Hellcat's tail, but it was too late. Eckerd had already gotten onto him, setting his airplane afire. And Kano bails out. He gets out of there. He lives to fight another day. But the fight's not over. 20 more of these Shidens arrive and pile into the fight. Other Japanese aircraft come in from all over the place and mixed up with the Hellcats, now from USS Hornet. 6 Hellcats are shot down to the loss of only 4 of the Japanese. Genda announced a bag of 52 American kills. Again, extremely exaggerated against the actual losses of 14.
Yeah, I just overclaiming to an art form. The Japanese did it like nobody's business, but yeah.
Well, not to be outdone, we claimed 63 and the Japanese actually lost 25. Right. So, it's typical. It's typical for aircraft claims during the war. But I said, that the Japanese took it to the Americans. And then in that first pass against those Corsairs from Bennington, I think it would be hard to argue that they didn't. Because not only did they inflict casualties on the Corsairs, shooting down, what did I say, 3 or 4, and losing only 1 of their own aircraft, they forced the Corsairs out. So in other words, they pushed them out of the airspace. And I'm sorry, but that's a victory right there if you can do that.
And, again, you see analogs in the air war over Germany, where as the Luftwaffe's aces get narrowed down, they do the same thing. They concentrate the really good ones into some of the units that are using the Me-262 and stuff like that. Take what few remaining hot shots we've got and give them a really hot plane, and let's see what they can do. And they generally comported themselves pretty favorably. And we have the same thing here with 343 Ku. This is all they got left in terms of really seasoned aces.
Yeah, well, it just goes to show you that while our pilots are definitely hot sticks, there is no question about it. The Japanese, we talked about this extensively back when we were doing 1942, is that, these are probably the best pilots in the world.
Yeah, and they are certainly up there. Yeah. Suburo Sakai was a member of this unit as well, and flying with one eye, which is kind of ridiculous. But he would say of this Muto guy that he was a genius in the air, and rated Muto as probably a better pilot than he was. And considering that Sakai is one of the 2 highest scoring aces from Japan who actually lives through the war, that's pretty high praise. These are very good pilots in this unit. So
they're not all dead. Not yet.
They're not all dead.
Not yet. So, Bill, the attacks in Kyushu, pretty much after the 343 gets into the mix, and that's pretty much it. After this, we pull out of here. We hit the airfields. The attacks in Kyushu had done some good as far as Spruance is concerned. They'd done more than the Tokyo strikes, hadn't they?
Yeah, they have. Got some airfields, some ports, some warships, facilities. They all have been hit and destroyed. It's all told some 400 Japanese aircraft had also been destroyed in the air and on the ground, mainly on the ground. But the fleet had suffered especially hard in the Japanese retaliatory air attacks, just as we've been saying. 6 American aircraft carriers had been hit in various ways with varying degrees of damage. Big E, Wasp, and Franklin all required significant repair. Franklin, as you said, we're going to cover separately. Spruance left the decision to Mitscher, who after much deliberation decided to cancel the third day of strikes and pull away. 3 of his flat tops needed to go to the yard, and the others needed reprovisioning and rest. It was time to call it quits. Now I want to kind of wrap this up just for a minute. For those of you who haven't watched, or it's been a while since you watched our episode on the atomic bomb with Rich Frank, think about where we are right now. Iwo Jima, where we have higher rate of casualties than the Japanese do. You've got these raids, where we think the Japanese are down and out, and the pendulum swinging back, and they seem to have caught a second wind, right? And they're threatening us as well. And we got carriers that are being damaged when we thought we were on top of the world. And then we're going to have Okinawa coming up. We'll talk about that separately, right? And all these things are not going the way we thought and hoped they would. Yeah. We don't know how many of these Japanese pilots and airplanes are left, these really good pilots and airplanes are left. We don't know. We made a whole bunch of presumptions, and our presumptions are turning out to be wrong. As we're facing this decision, go back to the Rich Frank episode, as to whether or not how this invasion is going to continue, if we have to invade mainland Japan. I know, John, you and Seth, you both have strong opinions on this, but 2020 hindsight doesn't work in advance, folks. You know, it only works looking back. And that's the world we're facing at this point in the war.
Yeah, it's very true. Very true. Yeah. It's telling that, again, you know, we talked about Spruance and that, not Spruance, but we talked about Mitscher and how much of a scrappy little dude he was and how much of a fighter he was. And he was built in the realm of William Halsey's, that he always was looking for a fight. And he was frustrated with the attacks over Tokyo, and he was frustrated that he had to pull out. Now, here you are a month later, almost exactly a month later, and the weather's good and you're laying licks on the Japanese. But now, because the weather being good and because Ugaki brings all these bad dudes down here to lay the wood on the American fleet, I want to repeat that what you said, Bill. 6 American aircraft carriers had been hit to varying degrees, 3 of which had to return to the yard for major repairs, Franklin obviously being the biggest. But
Franklin's out of the war. I mean,
for sure.
You know, spoiler alert, but, you know, she's just dear Lord.
Gutted. Yeah, she's gutted.
So, the trajectory of the war, it's fairly clear that we're going to win this thing. But it's a question of the cost. And my God, the cost keeps going up and up and up, which is immensely frustrating, because it's absolutely clear to everybody that the Japanese have lost, but they ain't willing to give up.
They aren't acting like it.
Yeah, they aren't acting like it. That's right.
Yeah, and it's only going to get worse. You know, I mean, this is March 18th, 1945. Well, April 1st, 1945 starts Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. And the Japanese,
an eye-opener. Holy crap. Yeah. Anyway,
so that's going to be fun. While there was never any question exactly to what you guys are saying, that we were of course, going to win this war. Exactly to your point, John, is how much is it going to cost to win this war? And again, to your point, Bill, we've got control of the world's biggest ocean. We can park our fleet 60 miles off your shore, but now we're taking a beating by doing that very thing. So it's going to give Admiral Spruance and Marc Mitscher and Halsey and everybody else a little pause the next time they venture so close to Japanese home waters.
Yeah, for sure.
War ain't over yet, brother.
Nope.
Well, guys, anything else y'all want to add to this one?
No, I think we should shut up.
I think we should. And with that, we will. So we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please like and subscribe to our podcast wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review if you choose to do so. We do certainly appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this, if you're not already looking at it, look at our YouTube channel. If you have a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Yet again, I'm woefully behind in my responses. Forgive me, please. I'll get to you. I promise. I honestly do promise. bear with me. Bear with me. So once
we got a
again,
lot of email, folks.
Yeah, we do. Once again, my name is Seth Parent, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. Jon, my friend, thank you for being here with us again today, and we will see you again very soon when we take on Iceberg. That's gonna be a good one. Good mini, I should say.
Yeah, it's gonna take a while to get through that.
Indeed.
Yep.
Bill, bring us home.
And we'll see you again next week.